Wow, the broadcast is live, so I am going to say hello to everyone. Hello and welcome to Publishing's first online event. I'm Sophie Missing and I'm an editor at Daunt. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us, especially thank you for joining us on this very sunny evening. So sunny we've had to all close our curtains to block out the light streaming in. We are really thrilled to be here in the virtual studio with the critic Lucy Scholes and the author Jessie Burton. Our event tonight is celebrating the writer Penelope Mortimer, and Lucy and Jessie are going to be discussing, among other things, a collection of short stories that was first published in 1960, but which has been out of print for many years. That book is Saturday Lunch with the Brownings. And Daunt are delighted to have brought it back into print a couple of years ago, of weeks ago. These
time is just right now.
Yeah, exactly. A couple of weeks is a couple of years right now. The 12 stories in this book dissect the often sunny life and the compromises it can ask of women in particular, with razor-sharp precision, humour and empathy. And to quote a recent review in The Times, none of these stories is good. They are witty, despairing and sometimes horribly truthful. So the event tonight will last an hour, so it will finish at 8. And there should be time for a few questions at the end. So please send in your questions as comments throughout, and we'll do our best to ask them at the end. So I'm going to disappear from your screens very soon. But first I want to introduce Lucy and Penelope also. So Jessie Burton is the author of the Sunday Times best-selling novels, The Miniaturist, The Muse, The Confession, and the children's book, The Restless Girls. Her novels have been translated into 38 languages, and she's a regular essay writer for newspapers and magazines. The Miniaturist was the Sunday Times #1 bestseller, hardback and paperback, and a New York Times bestseller. It sold over 1 million copies in its first year of publication and was awarded the Waterstones Book of the Year and Book of the Year at the National Book Awards. In 2017, it was adapted into a major TV series for BBC One. The Muse was the Sunday Times #1 bestseller in both hardback and paperback and has sold more than 5,000 copies. The Confession is Jessie's third novel and became an immediate Sunday Times bestseller. The Confession is available in hardback now and available to order through the Daunt website, and it's coming out in a beautiful paperback in September. Sorry, I've gone very, very glazed. That's the sun.
The sun.
Fading out. To introduce Lucy Scholes. Lucy Scholes is a critic based in London. She writes about books, film and art for the Financial Times, The Telegraph, New York Review Daily, the New York Times Book Review, Literary Hub and Granta, among other publications. She also writes a monthly column for the Paris Review Daily about unjustly out of print and forgotten books, and is the managing editor of the literary magazine The Second Shelf, Rare Books and Words by Women. Lucy has written the fantastic introduction to our new edition of Saturday Lunch with the Brownings, which we highly recommend. And she has also written about Penelope Mortimer in her column in the Paris Review and in a long piece for the New York Review of Books. To introduce Penelope Mortimer. Penelope Mortimer was born in 1918 and died in 1999. She published her first novel in 1947, the year that she began contributing short stories to The New Yorker. She wrote 9 novels, including Daddy's Gone A-Hunting, The Pumpkiller, which was made into a film with Harold Pinter, and Long Distance. In the late 1960s, she became the Observer's film critic. In addition to fiction, she published 2 volumes of memoir, the Whitbread Prize-winning About Time and About Time 2. Jessie and Lucy, thank you so much for being here. It's a delight to be looking at your faces and your background too. And I know I, for one, am very excited to hear what you're both going to say this evening. So over to you.
Thank you very much. I think, well, we're quite excited to be here too, aren't we? And we talked quite a lot about Mortimer off the screen, so now it's quite nice to be doing it with an audience, I think.
Absolutely.
I was thinking, shall I read from the introduction to start with? That'd be a good way to start, do you think? Kind of introduce a little bit. So if anyone isn't so familiar with Mortimer, this should give you a slight introduction to her work, and then we'll discuss some more. During the late 1950s, when she wrote the 12 superb stories included in Saturday Lunch with the Brownings, the majority of which first appeared in the New Yorker, Penelope Mortimer was famous for being the beautiful, lauded authoress wife of the renowned barrister-cum-writer John Mortimer. Profiles of the couple featured in magazines ranging from Good Housekeeping to Tatler often accompanied by photographs with their picture-perfect 6 children. Wife and mother with identities that defined Mortimer, even as a writer. She had a regular parenting column, 5 girls and a boy, in the Evening Standard. And her fiction, both her short stories and the 4 novels she published thus far, Johanna in 1947, under the name Penelope Dimmitt, as she was then, A Villa in Summer, 1954, The Bright Prison, 1956, and Daddy's Gone A-Hunting, 1958, all dealt predominantly with the subjects of marriage and motherhood. She wasn't writing twee, cosy tales of domestic bliss, though. Instead, Mortimer was penning sharp, shrewd portraits of marital infidelity, strained, unhappy housewives and their insensitive husbands, impotently railing against the draining demands of parenthood, more often than not drowning their sorrows in drink. Much of this material she drew from her own life, especially when it came to her short stories, for which she said there was no need to look for ideas, as she put it in About Time 2, her second volume of memoirs. I mined my life for incidents with a beginning, a middle, and an end, finding even the dreariest of days contain nuggets of irony, farce, unpredictable behaviour. The cracks in her and John's marriage and the conflicts associated with finding much of her worth and value in the role of caregiver, while at the same time feeling stifled by domesticity, all provided rich fodder for her fiction. Daddy's Gone A-Hunting, for example, the book that precedes Saturday Lunch with the Brownings, depicts a suburban mother's attempts to procure an abortion for her student daughter, a situation Mortimer herself had found herself in when her eldest daughter, then at university, had fallen pregnant. It was quite a daring topic for the day, as evidenced by the resistance and disgust with which Mortimer's protagonist Ruth's attempts are met. You would really advise her to do this thing? Your own daughter? Good God, Ruth, I'm sorry, but you make me sick, expostulates the family GP when she turns to him for help. The reviews, however, were excellent. A remarkable and deeply disturbing achievement, declared one. Mortimer, who by the time she died at the age of 81 in 1999, had published 9 novels, this one short story collection, 2 volumes of memoir, a biography of the Queen Mother, screenplays, and an abundant body of journalism. She drew more heavily on her lived experience than most, not least because it proved such a reliable source of creative stimulus. Family life is her subject, and in Saturday Lunch with the Brownings, which was first published in 1960, she picks it apart with precise, swift, agile strokes. No one knows better how to catalogue in easy narrative the minutiae of domestic life, admitted one critic admiringly when the collection was first published, or how to undermine domestic life's apparent securities. Mortimer has a keen eye for the horror underneath the banality of the everyday, in particular that moment when something familiar and benign turns monstrous. So that's a little taste for people who haven't read the collection yet. I think the sort of monstrous element is something that always attracted me to these stories in the first place. I don't know about you, Jessie, whether you like that side of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's so shocking about them. And you know, you're reading what is ostensibly a very simple premise, a sort of domestic portrait, often like you mentioned, the husband, the wife, the children, the domestic setup. And yet underneath it is this kind of gaping maw of existential despair. Like, genuinely, some of the sentences are so shocking how they will just hairpin bend. That, you know, a couple are just sitting opposite each other after dinner, either side of a mantelpiece with a fire. She's knitting and he's reading, and yet his inner monologue is literally quoting the Bible, saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And that larynx is constricting with boredom and doom and loneliness. And loneliness as well as seems to be a big theme in her books, that both men and women suffer. And then we just like go back to the sound of the knitting needles of his wife. And it just seems like she's so good at sort of presenting the inescapability of the dilemma, of the light and the dark. And she can access it so quickly. It seems that monstrous kind of truth that's inside all of us, that we are so capable of violence towards each other, psychological violence, physical violence, damage. And yet we, for the most part, bob along on the surface as best we can.
There's nothing, it's interesting because everything you're saying is completely true, but there's nothing sort of overly dramatic about them though, is there? These are not stories that deal, I mean, I guess in a way I'm still struggling to understand how she manages to do that there's no sort of hyperbole, there's no, it's not melodramatic in any way, but all your descriptions is right. It is this great gaping maw underneath her. It is these moments on which a relationship flounders, or you know, a whole family sort of falls into this great kind of slough of despond. But yet you read them and they feel sort of acutely realistic and incredibly relatable, or I've always found them so.
That's her genius. Exactly. It's just nothing particularly dramatic happens. A little girl falls 8 foot down a cliff, or a couple has an argument in a Italian tailor's, or a family has Saturday lunch. And yet she encapsulates in it just everything that we can feel when we feel trapped, or that, you know, we haven't got the life that we want. I did note something down that that's in the short story that she wrote, and that's in the collection, Such a Super Evening, where this very modest woman is expressing that what she feels inside is wanting more than what you have. There was never quite enough of anything. That's what it was. But then sometimes her characters, when they do get everything, they live to excess. They drink and they fight and they have success, like the couple that she modeled herself and her husband on in that story. They suffer hugely from that. So it's like she seems to be saying the equilibrium, the perfect state of being, doesn't exist.
I think that's what's also one of the things that really attracted to me to her as a writer as well, was the fact that she was clearly trying to get to the bottom of this conundrum of, on the surface, and as I sort of talked about in that bit of the introduction I read, on the surface she had this incredible marriage. You know, she was married to this very intellectual, interesting, kind of intelligent man. She was hugely interesting and sort of, you know, intellectually inspiring herself. They were both writing loads of books, they were going to all the right parties, they had all these beautiful children, they had this kind of life to die for. And from the outside looking in, she also had achieved what I think so many women are still struggling for today, this kind of work-life balance, right? So you could be the wonderful mother, but you can also write these brilliant books, and you can be very fulfilled in your marriage, but you can also, you know, have time to yourself. And on the surface, that was what came across. And these, you know, I spent a lot of time in the libraries looking at these old editions of things like Tatler and Good Housekeeping, and these wonderful photographs of the couple, and these kind of write-ups about their brilliant family. And yet underneath the surface, she was really struggling. And I mean, the whole family was struggling. You know, it was terribly hard to keep up that facade. And she felt sort of, you know, equally drawn. She loved being a mother, she really liked having children, but she was sort of worn down by the kind of daily grind and the domesticity of it all. And she wanted to write, but then she couldn't, you know, she was always trying to balance it. And this is things that women are still trying to deal with today, aren't they?
Absolutely. And I think it's sometimes when you think about her biography and her clear gift and her sort of hunger to write, her hunger to live, her hunger to be a mother, it just feels like I want to say she was born in the wrong time. As you said, it is a dilemma still facing women. But it was obviously harder at that, slightly harder at that point in the 60s, you know, in the 50s and the 60s, when she's writing a lot of this work. Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, she really pinions patriarchal, like soft patriarchal damage as much as like the big stuff. It's just the patronizing men, the doctors, the lawyers, the kind of women who have nothing to do because literally they can't have a job, and that kind of madness that entails. And, you know, was it six children? Yeah. You know, that's a lot. And, you know, that's an understatement. It's a lot. But she had them from, like you were saying earlier, age 20. She was having children for sort of 20 years. Yeah, because she had her youngest when she was only 19, I think. And then she had her oldest when she was in her early 40s. So it was a huge amount of, you know, like her 20s and her 30s were spent entirely kind of being a mother and looking after lots of different children, which is I don't know how anyone
looks after 6 children and holds down a job, right? It's an impossible thing to try and do.
I think, and also, but what she does unapologetically is sort of sublimate that family life, that mother role, the father role, the children into high art, really. I mean, I think she's really so gifted, and these economic yet kind of devastating portrayals of her experience. And I just think that's very interesting that perhaps she came along before this discourse of, you know, women pushing back against being told or being asked in interviews or being assumed that they can only write what they know. She did that, but you know, in a way that male writers have done, and she made the experience universal. You know, the despair and the pain that some of these characters feel when they're in very banal moments make it feel relatable, but also to do with literally the condition of being human and not wanting to end life, but also not knowing how to operate life. And I think, you know, the use of family portraits of children in the stories are so fascinating to me, because it feels like she uses the children as mouthpieces, I suppose, for her adult or unresolved adult issues. I don't feel that many of the characters feel particularly integrated with themselves as grown people. They are childish, they are violent to each other. Not that I'm saying that children are naturally violent, but like there's a sort of consequence-free, there's both a message that there's everything has consequence, but that also you get up the next day and you do it again. And so there's like this repetition, but she does find, like, I think, beauty in moments, and her clarity of understanding of what people are like is in a few short words is amazing.
Yeah, there's that bit that I think we've talked about before in I think it's in Saturday Lunch with the Brownings, the story that the collection is named after, where she sees
her daughter. When she's talking about her daughter Melissa, and then looks at her husband.
Yes, that bit that you pointed out was so astute on so many levels. I think that's really a wonderful example of that. I don't know if we could read a bit of that out.
Yeah, I will.
People a taste. I think it was the one on page 43, I think. Is that right? From the bottom of 43 over, yeah?
Got it.
When you're not in the same room, it's a bit harder to do that. It's going to pass the book across.
Yeah, we've got matching books. It's good.
Yes.
Okay. So Madge is the mother and the wife in this story. Madge, as was her habit after Saturday lunch, went upstairs alone to the sitting room. She never argued with William in front of the children. It was part of the picture. She raged inside herself and trembled and often wept. But she had created him as Melissa and Rachel's father, and he must therefore be beyond reproach. There must be no disloyalty. She sat on the low windowsill and looked down at the garden. Melissa came out and shook the tablecloth in the sun. She could not even tell Melissa about her anxieties, because Melissa, though nearly 16, must be secure, must feel her parents united, must be happy. Her love for Melissa, older and stronger than any other love, was not part of the picture. It could suffer change and movement, and was the only thing, perhaps, in her life which would remain with her till her death. Nevertheless, she kept distant from her, afraid of factions, unfairness, any kind of turbulence. William is a good writer, she thought. It's funny he doesn't understand things.
That line is so
such a mic drop.
I know, it's so damning, and it's sort of, you know, it's so gentle, but it's also so damning at the same time, and it sort of sums up the entire problem with that situation there, right? Yeah,
and also it's like, I think that's one of the most loving passages in Mortimer that I've read, like very sincere and tender, and so it's so interesting that she can show that quite emotional intelligence and love, and then a quite sort of psychological understanding of her husband in the next sentence. You know, she has these great capacities, this character, Mortimer herself, that is it's really interesting because when I read them, I think about the contrast between those who are articulate in the stories and those who are inarticulate, and there is a sort of theme, it seems to me, for her, that she finds she wants to write about characters who don't know how to express what they're feeling. There's almost no words. Like, and as a writer, that's quite brave to just say, you know, like I wrote this down, actually. I've got my piece of paper. It's in the story, The Renegade. He did not know any words bad enough to express how he felt. And it's like, great, I'm going to copy that.
It's just, but it's not true. Even going to try and go there. Yeah,
like this is again the simplicity of the prose. It's just, he didn't know. These people are not always the most articulate. They sort of lope around rooms and they get upset and they cry and they say things that aren't quite what they want to say. And I think that's a real skill, because sometimes, you know, as a novelist, you're very tempted to create very articulate characters so that it makes your job easier. But she's very good at sort of sidestepping or kind of creating characters who are living in kind of obfuscation, really.
And I suppose also the way that she sort of does this effortless slipping between them as well, that you can be inside you know, the wife's head one minute, then the husband's the next, and you're kind of, and then you're on the outside looking in and you see what's being said, and you can, you know, the picture builds, I think. And I think one of the things that I like particularly about the story Saturday Lunch with the Brownings is that it is not, on the surface, it sort of comes across as maybe this is a story about a poor kind of put upon wife who's trying to do too much and her husband doesn't understand her. But if you read it properly, there's actually quite a lot of sympathy towards the husband as well. There's sympathy towards what I think what Mortimer's trying to do is sort of explain that the family dynamic in itself is a thing that puts them all under pressure. It's the fact that, you know, she has made that, you know, her husband is always, he's always sort of coming up against his own shortcomings. He can't seem to love the daughters who aren't his biological children as much as his own biological child. He's frustrated by them, but at the same time he has been their father and he's been there for them. And there's that wonderful bit in that you read, you know, she has made him in that image. She's turned him into the father. She can't now sort of, you know, turn against him. And there's a later scene when there's I think the three children are squabbling over breakfast, and it sort of slips away into the father's mind, and he's like, and you know, he says something like, "What the hell did I do to deserve this? You know, what was I doing?" And the way that she can suddenly inhabit his interiority as much as the wife's, I think, is really fascinating, because I don't want to, for a second, give the impression that this is a book that is, I mean, there are a lot of the stories, not all of them, but a lot of them are from the female point of view. And a lot of Mortimer's writing in her other novels is the same. It is, you know, she does write about women who often are in similar situations to her own life. And she drew very heavily on that. You know, we recognize that. But this is not just a sort of screaming into the void about how terrible it is just to be a mother. She does understand that being a child is hard, being a father is hard, you know, being a husband is hard as well.
No, I agree,
And I sort of feel that that's something that's not, I don't feel that I've seen that in a lot of other work, whether it's, you know, written at the same time as she was writing, or whether it's contemporary work. She has such a sort of fleetness of foot to be able to jump between these characters like that. And we were saying earlier, there's so much dialogue in these stories as well, right?
They're just made for the theatre or the TV or radio.
Yeah, I sort of wonder why they haven't been adapted into radio plays. Or, I mean, some of them would make astonishing, you know, really brilliant sort of just gems of a sort of drama. Maybe some kind of novelist should do this as a job, but do some adaptation work.
No, I totally agree. It's that thing of it's the family ecosystem is just too restrictive. And it denies the individual, whether you are a man or a woman or a child, whether you are 8 or 80, you've been trapped by a sort of set of rules.
Well, exactly. It's the sort of roles and the expectations that come with it, right? That they're all, and the problem is they're all sort of inflicting them on each other, and yet feeling very sort of bowed down by them themselves, and nobody can also escape. And it goes back to your point about the inarticulateness as well, because nobody can sort of quite get together and say, this is our problem, and then deal with it, because there is no escape as well. I suppose it is, you know, you are in that family and you have to deal with it.
That's it. Yeah, you can't run away. And then almost, I suppose there is a question there is, do they want to run away? That's the ultimate. What would happen to her if she didn't have her family, her inspiration, her husband's, you know, it's a kind of poison chalice, I suppose. But, you know, she did live alone for many, many decades, you know, after her kind of golden years, and didn't write as much, you know, of this kind of material. So I don't know. It's like she does seem to, it's that push and pull thing.
Well, yeah, because it was an incredibly productive period in her life as well. I mean, I think I mentioned briefly in the introductory bit, she was writing short stories. Most of the stories in this collection, I think bar one or two, initially appeared in the New Yorker, and she had a contract to write 6 stories a year for the New Yorker from 1957. She was writing for other things. She was writing that column about parenting. She was writing a huge amount of journalism. She and John were also collaborating on scripts. They were writing film scripts. You know, it was just, they wrote a travel log together called, I've got it on my shelf, I always forget about it, With Love and Lizards, about a holiday they took together with their family. I mean, there's just so many, it was just constant work, and so much of that would, but at the same time, it was drawing on her day-to-day life, you know, all the time. Yeah. So I think you're right. There was a real push and pull that this is, and I don't know, it must be such a hard position to be in. What do you do when it's kind of, when that's kind of drawing a lot of your energy in a day-to-day basis, but it's also really fueling your artistic?
Yeah, I don't know. Because I just don't know how you, I mean, I don't know much about her her personal stance on it all. I suppose, did she ever express resentment at the fact that she, I mean, you know, John Mortimer's career became far more mainstream and he continued to be very successful. Did she ever feel overlooked, or did she
yes hugely, I think. I mean, you know, I've read quite a few of her diaries when I was writing about her, and definitely there's a kind of, in the early years, in the sort of 50s, when she's writing a lot of the stories that are in this collection and novels at that time, she's also writing in her diary about struggling to find time to work while bringing up children, while dealing with all the domestic sort of, you know, the things that go on with running a household and looking after your husband and your children in the 1950s. And then as she gets older, even though she sort of becomes, you know, the children grow up, she and John separate, she gets all this sort of suddenly this time to write in a way. But again, John has gone off and had this sort of second, I don't know, he's got he's married again, he has a new family, and he's sort of starting afresh, and she feels very trapped in the role of being Penelope Mortimer, the wife, the ex-wife, and this mother of 6 children, which I think because she'd made such an identity of it early on and people knew about it so much, it was very hard. And so she never, and she does, she keeps writing, but she never feels that she writes. I mean, she does produce astonishing work. Her 1974 novel, Long Distance, is an astonishing piece of work that is about, it's sort of written in this very fragmentary form. It's incredibly sort of experimental and modern for its time. It's about a middle-aged woman who's starting over after divorce. It's set in this sort of weird half hospital, half literary sort of writing retreat. And she wrote it while she was at Yale in the States on a writing retreat there. And it was also influenced by some of her time she spent being hospitalized after she tried to kill herself earlier on. And this book is astonishing. It's this kind of amazing fragmentary form about this woman who is sort of torn to bits and has to start over again. And everyone, I mean, the New Yorker recognized it was wonderful. They published it in its entirety in the magazine, which was something they hadn't done since I think it was yeah, it must have been but it's gone straight out of my head. Who is it? Who, they hadn't done it since the 50s with somebody very famous, who off the top of my head I've just lost, but it's in the introduction. And a Salinger, they'd published a Salinger story, in the 1950s. So there's this incredible kind of work, but it didn't get recognized. It wasn't, I don't know, she sort of didn't get widespread acclaim that she wanted. And later in life, she also talks about she wants to write a book that is going to be a kind of Booker potential. She wants to write something that's going to be her big literary work. And she struggles with a couple of things towards the end of her life, and they don't get written. But, she is still writing, and she's writing in all her novels. I think all her novels are brilliant. I do think the short stories are one of the more stunning works of hers, for sure. They're definitely a good place to start as well if you haven't. Have you read any other of her works?
I've read The Pumpkin Eater and Daddy's Gone Hunting, but I've not read any of the later works. But it is interesting what you're saying about the, perhaps in the time that she was living as well, the role of mother, that kind of universal role, was maybe one of the only ways she could get those column inches, get that column in
right.
Whereas a man could stand perhaps more individually. But it is interesting as well that she includes, for somebody who had lots of children, who incorporates her children or children in the abstract into stories, that she wrote the short story Little Mrs. Perkins, which is about a woman who induces miscarriage or in a hospital and deceives her husband about it. And it's a really interesting one, because at the end of that story, the narrator, who's had her third child, is standing at a crossroads, a zebra crossing, with the buggy, and she's overheard through the hospital curtain this woman do this to she wants to go to Tenerife with her mother, this woman. She doesn't want to be pregnant. And she sees that woman in a sports car with the scarf and the glossy lips, with her fairly sort of befuddled looking husband next to her, indicating he didn't really know what happened in the hospital. And she literally describes the children's sticky hands, and they're following her over the road. And I just feel like she just likes to inhabit all these possibilities, a mother who enjoys being a mother who sometimes finds it deeply frustrating, a mother who watches a woman who chose that different path, which, as you said in your introduction, that's so, when she wrote Daddy's Gone Hunting, that was so controversial that she was, trying to seek an abortion for her daughter. So it feels like perhaps it was so integrated or synthesized into being the motherhood, the non-motherhood, or the motherhood, being a woman, being a wife. It couldn't have come out any other way because of when she was born and when she was writing. And I don't know, it just seems that it informs her writing, and it is about that, but it is about something greater. And I don't know many writers, male or female, who can do that. And the fact that you said that those short stories are the most powerful, like the miniaturizing, that she was a miniaturist, really. That's not a plug.
Let's take it as one, though. Yeah.
She was that, and her frustration in her later years of thinking, I'm projecting here, or I'm imagining here, she feels she has to write the big Booker book, the big masculine book. Whereas actually, her writing, we mentioned this before we came on air, that, I don't always feel her writing is, I don't want to gender her writing, but when we think of masculine writing, we say spare sentences and clear cut, economical, but her writing is quite like that. But she's writing about things that didn't get weren't given the kind of respect, and still aren't really.
Well, I was going to say, because your latest novel, The Confession, is all about motherhood, the choices that women make, whether they are going to be mothers, whether they're not, and what one gives up and what one embraces. So these are clearly still, the sort of ambivalence, I think, that you perfectly, really brilliantly put your finger on in that story, Little Miss Perkins. You know, these are things that we're probably only starting to really be comfortable with talking about today. I mean, there's been a lot more writing about motherhood recently, but I think airing that ambivalence, saying that you might have possibly, even if it's just for a split second, think, oh God, I'd rather be in the car without the kids with the sticky hands.
I just want to fly to Tenerife, you know.
Right, you know, or vice versa. Just think, you know, I really wish I did have children. You know, wasn't just, I think, you know, and these are things that you've written about. So I'm not suggesting that, I don't know if Penelope Mortimer was an influence, but I'm not suggesting it's a direct influence even, but these are still important things that women are thinking about today, right?
Definitely. And I think it's, you know, it is interesting to me that it's something that, you know, came to me quite organically, that this was a novel, you know, The Confession, that I wanted to write about, you know, a woman who has passed by the stereotypical markers of life. You know, she's no longer 30, that number that we sort of hang on, that, you know, things have to be wrapped up. And of course, in Mortimer's age, that would have been like close to death. Not by 30, but you know, and I definitely, you know, it was a great thrill to write a character like Connie Holden, who is herself a novelist, and, you know, wasn't quite modelled on Mortimer, but that kind of woman who writes authoritatively, so authoritatively that she's afforded the kind of respect and admiration that mainly male writers have had in the history of literature and literary criticism. And Connie does that, but she writes about, you know, women and women's desires and women's flaws. And the book that I wrote, I definitely wanted to sort of present the many paths that are faced us, but the reality that we can ultimately only take one. And I think that is something that will always interest writers, and particularly women, because there's something that feels, you know, it's a baby is the one thing you really can't take back to the shop, in a life where, you know, so much is about choice. And it's interesting with her as well, because I think she did have choices, but then there were certain things that I feel were taken out of her hands as well, like medically and, you know, in her relationships. And again, it just feels to me that in the written word, in the writing out of her life, or the recalibration of her own life into fiction, was a means of finding her feet, or finding some kind of assurance or understanding, or just an acknowledgement of the lack of, it's the ironic clarity that she has about how things are actually unclear. You know, what are we doing? Literally, I feel like that's what so many of her characters are asking. What on earth am I doing, and why am I doing it?
Yes.
Which maybe that's just the whole of literature.
It's the whole of life as well, right?
Yeah.
It's just, what the hell are we all doing here? But
Yeah,
she does do that particularly well. I also think, I mean, I think you and I mentioned briefly, or you mentioned briefly, children in her work. And I feel like this is something, I mean, you know, I've done it myself almost, you know, there's such an interest, I think, in her life, and because she turned her life into fiction, or recalibrated it, like we've said.
Yes.
And I think that sometimes what gets overlooked, and what particularly shine in these stories, is the way that she creates children. I mean, there are some really brilliant child characters in these.
Amazing. Yeah,
and
with a just agency.
Right. And I was very interested in, you know, whether you'd what you thought about that, whether it was particularly striking, because I think that I sort of ignore children in literature until they become like too, you know, I think you sort of, well, I don't know, maybe this is not making much sense, but, you know, there are obviously always children in a lot of novels, but then when you suddenly get a child that really comes alive on the page, like hers do, I suddenly start thinking, gosh, she's got such a kind of recognition of what makes a child's world, right? And what children see, and what they remember, and what sort of makes them tick. And I find that fascinating as well.
Yes, no, the children, they are such a variety of personalities in the stories, that, you know, from quite sort of children with fairly murderous instincts, like throwing rabbits off balconies, to very sweet sort of, you know, when she describes Rachel in Saturday Lunch with the Brownings, having a heart too big for her body and so full of passion that it sort of weighs her down, and she's all of like 7 years old. or maybe a bit older. But no, I agree. Like the seriousness with which she portrays the children, they are childlike, but they're often not childish, and it's actually ironically the adults who often are quite childish.
Yes.
And she actually describes them as feeling like children, especially after an argument, or acting or saying things that are, you know, quite tantrumy or like I said earlier, consequence free behavior. But yes, she is a great observer of children and what makes them tick, and how they view the world, like how they view adults. Because there's that great story, The King of Kissingdom, which is all told through, you're watching essentially a marriage crumble, and this young woman enter and become a bit of a ménage à trois at this house. And you're seeing it from a child's eye view, but you understand it perfectly, like what the adults are doing, even though the child is innocent. And that takes great skill. So yes, like you said earlier, this fleet-footedness to be able to like go into a husband's head and then into the wife's head, she does it with the children as well. And she sees adults through a child's eye as well. Yes, I wonder what it cost her to be so clear-sighted, though, to be honest. You know, when she says in that story, William, just, it's a shame, I don't understand how he doesn't understand things and people. And I think sometimes it's a bit of a curse to be so cognizant of everything that's bad about us as much as everything that's good.
Yeah, and I also wonder, I think particularly from reading her diaries and other writing, you know, she can be very so astute on the page, and, you know, draw these wonderful portraits of these families and see exactly where the fault lines are, where the kind of issues are. And yet off the page, in her own, in a sort of more the personal stuff, she's struggling as much as her characters are, which I suppose is the way that we all do. And I think there's something so humane about that. Like, it's, you know, I can be very astute about someone else's relationship, but, you know, make mistakes in my own, right? We're all kind of there. And I think, I don't know, I also admire that in her as well, I think, particularly. Yeah. Do you have a favourite story in this collection? I know that's a sort of terrible question to ask, but they're sort of, I'm always interested in which ones stand out for different people.
Yeah, it's interesting because they're very different to each other, even though we're talking about common themes, but they are tonally different. And I mean, I do love Such a Super Evening, because for those who haven't read it, it's for my money, it feels like a kind of almost like a send up of her own character. And, you know, this timid sort of church mouse woman with her husband who, you know, she says, we don't really go out, and we're not, but they find themselves hosting the Mathesons, who are this, as you described in the introduction, critics, creators, giant family, always in the magazines. Like, they'd be like an Instagram family now, and they'd be like having deals and stuff.
Yeah, she'd have to be on Instagram with all her beautiful children and the writing. Like
Ralph Lauren, kind of like for their Easter shot. And yet they are so horrendous in real life, and they just behave so badly. And at the end of it, there's almost a moral lesson, but because it's Mortimer, it's not really. It's just this woman who thought that she wanted this life, that she thought this, realizes that she's quite happy not having that life. So I really do like that one. And for kind of the last story in the collection, was it called Such a Lovely Surprise, or What a Lovely Surprise?
What a Lovely Surprise,
when this woman is having her birthday. And this is a great one because, you know, we've talked about the sort of challenge of having to do everything, having to be the mother, the cleaner, the cook, the clearer upper of tears and everything, and to write these amazing pieces of writing. And yet in this short story, the woman is given the day off. She's told to rest, and her children are very angry that she's not resting enough and that she's moving a chest of drawers because she's not supposed to do anything. And it's actually torturous for her to do nothing and to not be allowed to have any agency. It's almost worse than being in charge. And again, like with both those stories, there's no clear answer to what's the ideal or what's the preferred state of being. Is it to be the timid church mouse who hasn't got a glamorous life, or is it to be the glamorous yet completely chaotic internally person, or is it to be the mother who has to do everything, or the one who's not allowed to do anything? It's like she never presents really, and I don't mean this as, you know, to be like, no one's ever content.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a fair thing to say?
Yeah, no, I think so. These are not, you could not describe these people as content. That's definitely, yeah.
But can I read actually the beginning of the second honeymoon?
Oh, yes, do. That's a great beginning.
So this couple, Francis and Bernard, are Francis and Bernard. They're on clearly what is an attempt to sort of rekindle what they perceive was their first love when they first got married, and they're in Rome. So it opens by saying, "What are we doing?" Okay. "What are we doing?" Frances asked herself, staring up at the ornate ceiling. "What on earth do we think we're doing?" Tears of exasperation, disappointment shot to her eyes. Waking was the worst part of the day.
Oh my God.
What, she would demand of whatever stucco cherub, fly-blown lampshade, technicolor pietà that first met her eyes. What do we think we're doing? Her husband, sensing trouble, came warily out of sleep, feeling his way from worry to worry. Breakfast late, letters not come, bad dream, children dead or neglected, passports and travellers' checks stolen, ill perhaps, mosquitoes? At last, since she had not spoken, he arrived shakily at the point where he could open his eyes and take a quick look at the day. As usual, the sky was blue. As usual, church bells rang like gongs. As usual, vespers and lambrettas ripped the early morning like calico. For a moment, even he was not sure where they were. Pisa, Parma, Siena, Florence, Turin, Milan? Well, he said, pinning it down neatly, how does it feel to wake up in Rome? Exactly as it feels waking up anywhere else. Her head was turned away. He knew the expression of her face, burnt by tears, but refused to recognize it. He stretched, casually flinging an arm in her direction.
So good.
It's so good. It takes a lot of guts as well to just not gussy it up, to just, you know, present these people, and somehow we still find sympathy for them as we, you know, they're lucky people, they're in Rome. And I think that's the point as well. It's like, you've got to find something else, I don't know, some kind of rewarding interaction with each other, because you're not going to get it anywhere else. You're not going to get it in Rome. 8 people in a different short story, maybe not in a Mortimer story, would find succor in a Roman visit. But yeah, I think you know, I would hesitate to be so bold. She makes me feel bolder. She makes me want to be bolder as a writer, which is, you know, always a good.
You can't ask for anything more than that, really, can you? As a, you know, as a reader, that's the most brilliant thing. I feel like that's quite a good place to maybe let Sophie come back in. I think she's got some questions from people who've been watching for us. So don't know if you're there, Sophie. Here she comes.
Hello, I'm back.
Hi.
Thank you so much to you both for such a fascinating discussion. I do have some questions. The first one is for you both. It's from Jacob from YouTube. And the question is, if Penelope Mortimer were writing today, what would be her big subjects?
Whew. Well, Lucy? I think the same. I
mean, yeah, I sort of feel like I think she would still be writing about family life. I think because I don't know, it remains her subject through
regenerative. So
yeah, I mean, later on she definitely changed. I mean, I should make clear that her early work in the 50s is very much about family life. It's about marriage. It's about people, negotiating children, and your relationship with your partner. And as time went on, and she and John broke up, and then she wrote a novel called The Home, which is all about a woman starting over after divorce. She wrote another book called My Friend Said It's Bulletproof, which again is about a woman starting over after having a mastectomy. And then there was The Handyman, which is about a woman starting over after widowhood. So she continues to mine her own life in this sense. So were she alive today, I think it would depend on how old she was, at which point in her life she'd be. Yeah. But I think she would still be mining her own life for these experiences. And
sorry to interrupt. Did she ever write about? Did any of her children have children? Was there ever a grandmother narrative?
Well, the woman in The Handyman is older. She's definitely does she have grandchildren? I'm just trying to think now. She definitely has children who are grown up.
Right.
So she doesn't talk, there's not a particular novel in which she really talks about being a grandmother as the great subject. Definitely it's widowhood in The Handyman, but this is an older woman who's kind of going into widowhood. But there were two novels that she was writing towards the end of her life, which she never got published. She never finished them. And one was about a old woman called Agatha who hadn't had children, and Penelope, I think, wanted to mine the idea of what her life could have been like without children. And the other one was going to be a grand sort of retelling of King Lear, but from the point of view as a grand matriarch instead, which I think is a fascinating, and I wish she'd written that, but she didn't manage to finish it. So she clearly wanted to sort of expand slightly, but I think, I don't know, unless she'd have been captivated by the Instagram generation, I think it still would have been family, her own life would have been feeding her work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the story still feels so fresh now, right? I think, as you've been discussing.
Though I would also just point out, if I may, like, if you want to read more about the sort of different side of her, do read her second autobiography, About Time too, not least because it contains some fascinating stories about her friendship with Betty Davis by the time she moved to America for quite a lot of the 70s, teaching over there. And she tells, I feel like I should just read this tiny bit out from it. But she says, so Betty Davis has helped her find a house to live in. And she goes, Betty was herself again, staggering a bit. She produced a lavish picnic, made lists, told me what to eat and drink, showed me how the dishwasher worked, broke a number of plates, swore a great deal, prepared me a supper of southern fried chicken, told several scurrilous stories about Joan Crawford, and finally left. So I just think... so she sort of, I don't know, there are other strings to her bow, but I wish she'd written a story about Betty Davis. That would have been wonderful.
But that's also, her success as a writer took her to those scenarios as well. So it wasn't.
Oh yes.
That's good to know, because it's sort of it didn't. Sometimes you think, well, it didn't happen for her, or stopped happening, but there was things.
Well, I think she sort of, like, maybe she thought that it wasn't happening so much here, but she was actually very fated in America. I mean, she was teaching at Boston University, at the New School in New York. She sort of knew these incredible people writing for the New Yorker. She didn't kind of move over there, and resettle. But she had some really and she was at Yaddo a couple of times in the 70s and wrote incredible books there. So she did have a sort of huge literary success as well, that was just maybe not quite what she'd expected. I don't know.
Right. Not through a kind of British prison.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's it. Once she'd sort of, 70s was definitely the sort of the era of America for her. But yeah, she came back. Sorry, that was a very long way of answering that question, Sophie. Sorry.
No, that was great. Thank you. I've got another question from Sue via Facebook. Thinking about her portrayal of children, can you think of other writers who do it so well? Maybe Ivy Compton Burnett, or Elizabeth Bowen, or Elizabeth Taylor. This seems to be an underestimated skill.
Yeah, I agree.
You have some thoughts on that, Jessie?
Well, I mean, those are good. Those are good suggestions. I'm trying to think. Anyone else that comes to mind quickly?
I think Penelope Lively does it very well as well. I think she's quite good.
Tessa Hadley, she does well.
Yes. Yes.
that well. Yeah, that's my 10 pence worth. Tessa, I can't think of
No, those are both great.
like that. It's like I don't read.
No, but it is hard. It's hard to do it well. So I think that's a nice selection, I think, there.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Thank you, Sue. And I've got a question that came in over email for Jessie, which is, do you find it useful reading fiction from a certain period when you're writing yourself?
No, actually. It's more the writer in question. So, reading someone like Mortimer is like having a tall, cool glass of water, because it's clear and it's sort of pared back, and I might try and take that kind of energy into my own sentences. Of course, it never comes out. That's the kind of strange alchemy that you can read and read, and you should read and read, but it never ever comes out the same way as that person, unless you're like directly copying. So no, I don't seek novels that are either written around the period that I'm writing or are written by someone who was alive in that time. It's a bit more abstract than that. I mean, it has happened, now I say that, like a couple of times I may have read a novel that's set in a similar period, just to sort of check, whether we've got the same historical notes. But generally, I don't. I'm more led by the writing. So I could be reading quite contemporary novelists or poets or modernists and writing a book set in, the 1800s or something. It's more about the sentence structure, how that kind of gets into your brain.
Can I ask, just on the back of that, I'm interested, do you still read novels when you're deep in writing your own?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. I couldn't not really. I mean, it's a bit embarrassing. I haven't read as much as I'd like to this year, because I am writing and I'm reading research books around the novel I'm writing. But no, I love reading other people's work when I'm writing. I never really stop that. Unless it's like really, really, really brilliant writing, and then I'm like, no, I can't. I'm just
puts you off.
I don't know.
No, I've spoken to some authors who say they don't because they're worried it would seep into their work. But I imagine you've also got to be reading quite a lot of the author for that to happen. I don't know.
I really do question that. Like I think your own vision is so strong that even if it did seep in, you would still make it your own.
Right.
The one, when I was younger, the one that would always make me write like him is Garcia Marquez. Like I would end up just like it. There was something about the rhythms and the images that, you sort of, it's very easy to fall into. But what I was probably writing was quite pastiche. It's quite easy to, pastiche magic realism. So, but generally I think it surely, all it does is hopefully just like elevate your own writing, because it's like a patchwork. You take influences like painters do, I suppose.
Sorry, Sophie, I interrupted you.
No, cool. I think we have time for one last question. So we've got one from Jeremy via YouTube. A question for Lucy and Jessie: which book would they like to be republished?
Oh, wow.
Oh gosh, of any writer.
Any book.
I mean,
is this a Mortimer book or any writer book?
It could be a Mortimer book. I'm not sure if it's any book, but so however you would like to answer.
Gosh, I mean, Lucy, this is definitely your forte, because you know so much about books that have been overlooked.
I have two. Well, I don't know. I'm trying to think. I have too many to. One I have read recently, which I do think is very much worth reading and republishing, is a very forgotten lost novel from the 1960s called Mojo Hand by a writer, J.J. Phillips. And she was a young Black American writer who wrote this when she was, barely out of her teens, and it is an astonishing book. It breathes the rhythm of sort of jazz and the blues, and it was, it's just been sort of overlooked over the years. It's out of print at the moment, and I wrote about it recently. And rarely have I come across, I write about out of print books a lot, but rarely have I found one which I'm just sort of astonished that it's not in print. There's often a reason, and this one I think is,
wow.
I've never come across anything quite like it. So that, and if I had to choose a Mortimer book, I think the one I would see back in print next would probably be The Home, because it's the sort of sequel to The Pumpkin Eater in all but name. So I think people would find that sort of fascinating, but that's for another day, perhaps. I don't know. Jessie, what do you think? Have you got a book that you...
I don't know any. The books that I know, I'm very much a sort of, I wait and I read the books as they come out. I don't...
Well, there's also so much work. I mean, Daunt is very good at this, at republishing forgotten books, classics and things like that. So actually there's a lot.
Exactly. So like anything that I would say is actually, I would know about it probably because it was published.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. There are things, sometimes I remember it was you, Lucy, who suggested that I read Saturday Lunch with Brownings, and I tried to get a copy and I couldn't. I got a secondhand copy of A Books, and then I was reading it, and I was reading the story Little Miss Perkins, which is just such a great story. Like, it's so gripping, and you're just like, what is this woman doing in this hospital bed? And as I turned the page, there was pages missing, and the story just hopped to the next story, and I was like, that thing where you start reading and you're like, I'm not sure whether this is avant-garde or I've lost all the characters, we're in a totally different setting. And I realised what had happened, and my partner bought me a first edition of Saturday Lunch with Brownings for my birthday last year, so I could finish the story. And yeah, so that's kind of, when I get recommended things, I might find them on secondhand books, but normally everything I know is people are doing very good work at Daunt and Persephone as well, bringing things back.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to people like Lucy as well for writing her wonderful column.
Well, exactly.
There's so many good books out there, so
I know. It's a lot.
Well, Lucy, you are surrounded by books, as we can see, so very impressive background.
Just trying to make myself look bookish.
I'm trying to make myself look musical. I cannot play.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that actually. Is that are you going to strum something later? So.
I'm going to sing you all a song now.
People would love that, I suspect. Yeah, please do.
It's not my guitar.
Thank you both so much. I think we can wrap up there.
Thank you, Sophie, and thanks for publishing. Thanks for republishing it. It's such a lovely copy, and I think everyone should go and buy it if they haven't already, obviously.
Yes, I feel I should say copies are available to buy through Daunt Books, and copies of Jessie's novel, The Confession, are also available.
Yeah, buy that as well, everyone.
Do, it's excellent. Thank you for tuning in, and good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.